If the Chinese government were to use military force to subdue Hong Kong democracy protesters, would the United States government take steps to directly intervene?
Yeah. You never want to, that's a great question because I don't have to answer it. Anytime a question starts with F, if you can feel the free pass coming. It's the case that not only the United States, but the United Kingdom and now several dozen countries in the world have all made clear our expectation of how China will behave with respect to the people of Hong Kong. That expectation is based on the commitments that the Chinese government made. And so we've said repeatedly to General Secretary Xi, honor that commitment. You promised there would be one country, two systems. We've encouraged not only Beijing, but the protesters to engage in this political discourse for what the people of Hong Kong want in a way that is nonviolent, that can, with some hope, be resolved in a way that is peaceful, with few injuries and less violence. That is our expectation, and we've made that clear to everyone operating in that space. As for what would happen, I just never foreclose any possibility for how President Trump might think about how we should appropriately respond. Look, if you read the documentation, right, it's very clear that this is, again, to the first question about, or the second question about Crimea and the Golan. These situations are all highly factually dependent. You've got international law that overlays it. I'll just stop there.
Okay.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here. It's always great to be where everything's bigger here in Texas. My team, as I was flying out this morning, reminded me that it is not its own country, so this is a domestic trip. I know you all may think differently. I get it. Thank you too, Jim, for that very generous introduction. I appreciate it. It's wonderful to be here at the Baker Institute. You were so kind. When I was nominated to be Secretary of State, I was CI Director. One of the very first phone calls I made was to Secretary Baker and said, hey, would you come? He flew out, spent a handful of hours with me out in Langley. And that time has certainly been much to my benefit, as I'm a better Secretary of State because of the wisdom that you imparted to me that day. You asked me to. You said, here's the deal. You got to come to the Baker Institute. And I'm now upholding my end of the quid pro quo, you know? Yeah. You got to have fun along the way. Look, the State Department's had a 26-year partnership with your Center for Energy Studies and many other fruitful ties, and we thank you for that. I want to thank you personally for that invitation to be here today. There are lots of great stories about Secretary Baker, and great stories about you too, Susan. A lovely couple that served America so graciously for so many years. Yeah. And Jim, you may have had more than one motto, but one of them was the prior preparation prevents poor performance. I left out an adjective for the public audience here, but I think that's certainly true. Stories, too, about your Texas flair, like your propensity to put tobacco on tuna salad, a staple now at the State Department. And stories, too, about the amazing relationship you had with George H.W. Bush, President Bush, a man who had great influence on me as well, having served as a director at the Central Intelligence Agency. You were very respectful of President Bush, but he wasn't afraid on occasion to make his case very clearly to someone who was your close friend. And you told me the story that day. You reminded me that every now and again he would say, Jim, if you're so damn smart, why are you not the president? More seriously, I was thinking about your time at the State Department last week. I was in Germany on the occasion of commemorating the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Although Secretary Baker himself would give all the credit to his boss, President Bush, no one should ever underestimate Secretary Baker's individual contribution to taking down that wall. You helped lay the foundation for an international coalition to drive Saddam from Kuwait, and you have been a tough act to follow at Foggy Bottom. These are immense achievements for America's national security. For those of us who remember the history when we had peoples who languished under the Soviets and Saddam, these were achievements for mankind more broadly as well. As you wrote in your memoirs, I think a bit too modestly, you said, "We diplomats should only take a little bit of credit for these titanic shifts because the true responsibility for changes in the world we inhabit lies in ordinary men and women who sought freedom, who struggled against darkness and totalitarianism, and who rose up to achieve liberty for themselves." I saw that last week. I was reminded that's the subject of my remarks today. I want to talk about the natural hunger for human freedom and why we should never underestimate its great and awesome power, and our responsibility to assist those people around the world who are seeking that human freedom. I talked about my trip last week. I witnessed this power myself. In the late 1980s, I was a young lieutenant serving in a tank unit in southern Germany. We patrolled the then East German border and a little bit of the then Czechoslovakian border. There I saw people try to come across to freedom from the East German side. We visited last week a little town called Molderoid. It was a small town that was completely bisected by a wall and by barbed wire to the West German side. Families separated by this fence in the same town, buildings literally inches from each other on opposite sides of authoritarianism and freedom. And like so many thousands of brave Germans, these people in Molderoid valued their freedom so much they were willing to risk dying for it. I was powerfully reminded of their courage as I, for the first time, walked across what had then been that border last week. A section of the wall still stands there. The barbed wire remains. There's a guard tower that's been preserved. The townspeople of the now united Molderoid never want to forget the horrors of communism and what it wrought for their families. And we should never forget that either, and we should never forget the good works, the force for good that America was in that important achievement. And we should appreciate what freedom has achieved, at the same time remembering the past. We take for granted, my son now is 29 years old, so just after this monumental achievement. Sometimes I think people take for granted what happened, but those who lived it and worked it know that German reunification wasn't always easy. Life in Molderoid today is undoubtedly better than it was behind the Iron Curtain. The work that we did, we saw it again when we traveled to Leipzig. We visited the site of a place called St. Nicholas Church, the site of the very first protest against the former so-called German Democratic Republic, something that Secretary Baker did on the 25th anniversary of the fall of that wall. East Germans began to gather in that church in the 1980s. They went there on Monday nights to pray for peace. I had a chance to meet some of the former protesters who had participated in the peaceful revolution. They said each time they went, they didn't know what would happen when they stepped out, when they exited that church. They knew that they were being followed, but they watched the protests swell and swell. There was one gentleman who remarked to me that when the crowd numbered around what he estimated would have been 70,000 people, he thought, what will the Stasi do? Can it be the case that they will shoot all of us? And he, saying that he did not know, said, I went to the streets. He was young. He would have been in his early 20s at the time. They all found safety in those numbers, strength in their faith, and safe haven in that church. And the story of the church in Leipzig speaks to larger truths, I think, for each and every one of us and for our responsibility in the world. The longing for freedom accrues and is common to all of humanity. No person desires subjugation at the hands of another. We are all indeed formed in God's image, and we've all been endowed by Him with the right to live freely, with the unalienable rights that our founders knew so well, the right to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. I think people know these universal truths exist deep down in their souls. I think it's by the very nature of our humanity. I felt it when I served in West Germany and looked across the barriers to East Germany. Even in the darkest days of the Cold War, there were periodic eruptions. We would see them. Those eruptions were always in the support of delivery in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, in Poland, and in many places where individual acts of bravery, frankly, never received any public attention. I fast forward to my time now as secretary. We see the same fight for freedom today. We see it in the people in the Islamic Republic of Iran. We see it in people in Venezuela. And we see it in the people of Hong Kong. And we should never devalue their deep desire for their personal freedom and for their personal liberty. It's a noble goal. And it's no coincidence that the most successful societies in the world are indeed free societies, because they're the only place, and I think we all know this, they're the only place that men and women can reach their true potential. We've seen it. We've seen this same story play out time and time again. Look at how the lives of the people in places like Poland or the Baltics changed for the better after the remarkable work that took place during the Cold War. Look at the prosperity of Pacific pillars like Taiwan or of South Korea. Look at the wonderful experiment that we have here in the United States of America. It's rambunctious and it's free. And freedom's benefits are vast, and history proves it. And America's role in enhancing freedom around the world is central to the world's understanding of how it is we can achieve that. We should never take the march towards freedom is by fate. It's by hard work. I remember I left Germany in October of 1989. I was heading back for my next assignment in the 4th Infantry Division in Colorado. So a handful of weeks. And I remember I called back, weren't cell phones at the time, but I called back to my own unit to a friend named Jeff Bubar, who was my fellow lieutenant, and said, "Jeff, what the heck?" And he said, "Mike, you know, we were patrolling this space. We were blocking people from coming across these roads, and the folks on the other side were blocking them too. We spent our entire time as young officers there." And he said, "Mike, there's traffic going in only one direction. Only one direction. The wall came down and everybody moved towards freedom." But of course, we had to work for it. It took decades of effort across multiple administrations. And with the help of allies and the people of East Germany, we rid the world of the Soviet scourge. It took patient diplomacy of men like Secretary Baker. And victory was not a foregone conclusion. You can go back and read the quotes days and weeks and months before the wall fell, and there were critics that said, "Your policy is failing, it's not working, this is going to last forever." And no one knew the day that it would come. Look at places today. Look south to Venezuela, to Nicaragua, to Cuba. There are many examples, sadly. What day their freedom will come, we do not know. But we know that if we work and collect friends and build out a mission set and support those seeking freedom, that moment will come. There are certainly limits. Secretary Baker referred to this too. We have enormous power, but it is certainly limited. There are limits to the assistance that we can provide. Our pocketbooks and resources aren't unlimited. But we should every moment look for places where we stand with those that are seeking freedom. The good news is we have lots of advantages. Our democracies make us very, very resilient. Our free and competitive markets help us all prosper. Our rule of law anchors our gains and allows us to peacefully resolve disputes. And our free and democratic values allow us to realize human flourishing that no other nation can compete with. I would put America's exceptional track record up against anyone, anywhere, anytime. But we shouldn't take it for granted. As Secretary Baker so eloquently observed, we should never underestimate the ordinary men and women and their desire to be free, ever. On this trip, I had a chance to meet a handful more of these folks. I went when I was in Berlin. I had a chance to stop in a Stasi Museum in what was former East Berlin. Several former prisoners were there to serve as guides to tell us the stories, the history of what had taken place in that particular space. It was unmitigated evil. Prisoners never knew what was coming. Indeed, the guards used to wear slippers, so the prisoners could not hear them coming down the hall. And yet the human spirit survived. One of those who survived, a man, told me that he was placed in total isolation, but that a few times a week the guards would let him outside, not completely, but in a cage. And they were told to look down, but he would glance up. And when he would glance up from time to time, he would hear some noise, and he would be told, look down, look down. But he saw and knew that there was a particular Pan Am flight that came by. He said it was his dream to get on one of those planes one day. What remarkable courage. And we should all be proud of what he did and what those seeking freedom did and what the world did and what America did to allow him to have that opportunity. Never underestimate the courage of that man or those who seek freedom. And never stop working for their triumph, wherever and wherever we can. America is a force for good. We are imperfect. We get it wrong from time to time. But wherever we go, I have leaders from all across the world who want to see the American Secretary of State. Not Mike, but the American Secretary of State, because they know that we will be a force for good in their country, in their region, in their part of the world, and that we will act for freedom and for what is good for the world. I hope God blesses this institute with its continued success, and may God bless our great country as well. And I look forward to taking a handful of questions about almost anything.